to Short Story Boudoir. My name is Samantha Neugebauer.
I'm Katy Gathright.
And today we have a special guest with us, Jean McGarry, who is a novelist and short story writer and has spent most of her career as a professor at Johns Hopkins. And we're here in Baltimore in her house and with her library behind us, which is lovely. Thank you for being here, Jean.
Yeah, we're very excited to dive into a story today. As always, we're going to be talking about The Lady with the Dog by Chekhov, and we have our patron saint Chekhov in the background on the wall. So thank you again to Jean for hosting us here. Before we get into the story, as you know, we always really dive into the meat of these stories, so please do read the story before the conversation because there will be spoilers. Although I think it's pretty hard to spoil the story without reading it because it's so special. But I'll just start with a very high level summary and then we'll turn it over to Jean to share more thoughts to kick us off. But essentially this story begins when Gaurov who's a Russian banker, comes to the vacation town of Yalta, and he meets a young woman who is known as the woman with the dog, and they kind of kick off an affair that begins with them sort of meeting and then sort of tumbling into this gradually more and more sort of passionate entanglement. But they spend time together in Yalta. She expresses reservation. There's a lot of big sort of feelings expressed on both of their parts, but they end up parting. She's married, he's married, and they leave town. But he comes and visits her in her hometown, and that kicks things off again. He finds her at the opera, and then the entanglement kind of begins anew, and she continues to visit him every few months, and they're sort of in an official affair, and the story ends when they kind of have another coming to a head conversation about what they're going to do about their situation, about being in love, but also having these other obligations, namely their spouses. And then it sort of ends on this really delicate note. I'm sure we'll talk more about that, where they again are sort of pondering what to do, and there's this sense that the most difficult phase is yet ahead. So the summary is very vague. It's an interesting story because the plot really doesn't do it justice. There's so much between the lines, and it's almost not worth summarizing in that way. But I'll kick it over to Jean to dive in a little bit deeper.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I think this is probably one of the most perfect short stories that exists. And I think there are a number of reasons why, and I would agree that the summary doesn't do justice to the story. I think primarily because it's not only about a love affair. I think one of the things that the story does so well is Gaurov undergoes a transformation in 20 pages, but Chekhov prepares for this by making him ambiguous, better than he appears. He deplores what he calls women the lower breed, but can't live without them. I mean, throughout. So the story starts out with a man who doesn't really know himself that well, and I think there's a sense in which he's also presenting himself, and he's presenting himself in the worst possible light. But at the same time, there's other information that's being given to us that shows that he's not exactly who he thinks he is. So there's room at the beginning of the story for this transformation to take place. So I think that alone, and I just thought a couple of examples of this presentation, it will show just how ingenious this work is. So here's his, and I guess how I would characterize this is that what Chekhov is able to do is present a psychological portrait that contains contradictions that most writers wouldn't even see. So here's the first example when he's thinking about his wife. First, he presents her as kind of a haughty, insensitive person, and then says, just as part of a sentence, and though he secretly considered her not particularly intelligent, narrow-minded, and inelegant, he was afraid of her and disliked being at home. And I thought, this is where we start getting this notion that, I mean, we don't we don't often think of people as disparaging someone, but also being afraid of them, especially in an intimate relationship. Then, or just farther on, he's talking about how many affairs he's had. There's a flip-flop again about he disparages women, and yet the women are the only people he can really talk to and be with. So right from the beginning, we're getting this ambiguity that's going to involve the turn. There's also an element of kind of modesty, because here again we're getting him describing himself, even though it's third person. There was something attractive, something elusive in his appearance, in his character, in his whole person, that women found interesting and irresistible. He was aware of it and was himself drawn to them by some irresistible force. So the combination of the fact that he was aware of it should be followed by, and he took advantage of it, but it's followed by some mutuality that's going to happen in the course of the story. To write a story where an author prepares so well for what's going to happen, and what's going to happen is a huge change, is miraculous in my mind. And the next thing that happens is when these two people meet, even though he's twice her age and much more experienced in love, and when he makes a joke that's a little bit abrasive, she gets it. Mm-hmm. He makes a joke that sort of makes fun of what she's already said. She laughs. So, the beginning of a relationship that's going to be important. The groundwork is laid for that. One other thing that I think in his letters, Chekhov, he instructed everybody he wrote to with how to be an artist. And one of the things that he says is, you're going to write a love story, you shouldn't pay any attention to the mooning and all of this. You should be writing about what's on the table, what's out the window, what does the room smell like, and this is exactly what he does in the story, where more attention is paid to landscape and setting and scent and food, and all of this allows the reader to fall in love with the characters and for them to fall in love with each other. It's just the most brilliant way to create a story.
Do you think, when I read stories that are of this caliber, which is not all the time, sometimes the characterizations feel like they're piling on, but you're losing like the beginning characterizations. So they're always in flux in a way. And I wonder if in some ways that's what's happening here, where you're learning more and more, and some of these things are divergent ideas about the character, as opposed to a story where maybe the writer or the narrator is trying to pin the person down,
right,
like a butterfly or something, exactly. Right? And so then the butterfly's dead, so it's not in flux. And I guess my statement / question is really then, do you think this is part of the reason why people like this story so much? Like the characters themselves, or that relationship with the narrator?
I think that readers who are encountering this story for the first time, I think they're bewildered as they're reading. Mm-hmm. They don't, this looks like, he seems like a cad. He's not a cad. Mm-hmm. She seems like a kind of a naive ninny. Mm-hmm. He's not exactly. So I think that Chekhov characterizes without labeling, and it gives his characters room to grow. And I think partly this happens as he's writing about himself in this story. Mm-hmm. So he is castigating himself, and he's also allowing himself to be himself.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I like what you're saying too about not focusing on describing the love or the wooing and more on the setting around them, because I do feel like it makes their relationship feel like it's grounded in reality in a way that it wouldn't necessarily otherwise. I mean, it's sort of on the surface, again, in the summary it sounds like, oh, they meet on vacation and they tumble into this thing, but it's not really like that, It does feel like something that's happening between two very real people, and not just the story you tell yourself about people meeting on vacation.
Well, I think one of the devices, well, I've never applied that word really. I don't think Chekhov used devices, but I think one of the things that he does so successfully is proportion out the scenes. So the reader has a chance to see them living their daily lives, and even though they're on vacation, but he gives the relationship enough time that you can kind of see it blossoming.
Yeah.
And blossoming to the point where it becomes almost an obsession.
Yeah.
But never falls into that pathological character. It's
Well, I love the pacing in the story,
Yeah.
which I think this is not a unique accolade of this Chekhov story necessarily, but I think that it's just so satisfying how we move in time, and even when they are still at in Yalta, we get one of the sections starts like a week later, and it's just, you just feel you've not been cheated of anything. At the same time, you feel ready to go there with the story, and that is part of the enjoyment of the story for me, for sure. How time moves in this.
even though it's still short.
It's still very
You know,
short.
It's not a novel.
It is not. No. And so in the latter part of the story, now they're in a relationship, and she comes to Moscow every 2 or 3 months, I think we're told, plot-wise. And we have our protagonist walking his young daughter to school, and he knows that she has come to town. And he's kind of chatting with his daughter about like normal things, and we're also told that he's thinking that he had 2 lives, one open, seen, and known, and the other running its course in secret. And so it's hard not to think as, writers that this double life is something that we are all familiar with and cultivate in a way. Maybe when we see, something, or we hear something, or we hear a great detail of a profession that, oh, this could work, in a story. And we kind of, treasure our secret life. So Chekhov himself, if I'm right, was also a doctor. Is that correct? So he also had this dual life in that way. And I'm wondering if you think that Chekhov or the narrator is suggesting that an affair is also a creative act in the same way, maybe. Or like, what else is interesting about this concept of a double life?
Question that is. Well, I don't think Chekhov wants to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
I think what he wants to do is something he does when they first go to Oreanda, when they travel, where he's taking the relationship out of itself and putting it somewhere else. He's not just displacing it. He's saying, really, the relationship isn't that important. That it's only among the many things that are occurring in life, only one of them. And so, this is, to me, this is the genius in the story. Is they're just newly in love, and they start because they have the habit, or they've created a habit of going up the mountain to Oreanda. Chekhov enlarges the scene, and this is what he says. Yalta could scarcely be seen through the morning mist. White clouds lay motionless on the mountaintops. Not a leaf stirred on the trees. The cicadas chirped, and the monotonous, hollow roar of the sea, coming up from below, spoke of rest, of eternal sleep awaiting us all. Suddenly changed us, right? We're suddenly us in this story. The sea had roared like that down below when there was no Yalta or Oreanda. It was roaring now, and it would go on roaring as indifferently and hollowly when we were here no more. And in this constancy, in this complete indifference to the life and death of each one of us, there is perhaps hidden the guarantee of our eternal salvation, the never-ceasing motion of life on earth, the never-ceasing movement toward perfection. Now, this is a piece of poetry that it would take a long time to parse, because he's not really saying there's an afterlife. He's not, by using the word salvation, has nothing to do with Christianity. It has to do with eternity. And so he's sort of saying, if you take this cosmic view, perhaps you could say the love affair is a work of art. The love affair is a necessity in both of these people's lives, but it isn't really that big a deal. So when
necessity, but not a big deal.
So at the end, I think this is the exquisiteness of this story. When he's walking to meet his lover, he has a moment with his child that is so charming that you can feel this tension that's going to be in his life. So I just want to read this quickly. It's 3 degrees above zero, Gurov was saying to his daughter, and yet it's snowing. But then you see it's only warm on the Earth's surface. In the upper layers of the atmosphere, the temperature is quite different. Why isn't there any thunder in winter, Daddy? He explained that too. I mean, this is a scene of parenthood that is so genuine, and there it is, where it's plunked right in the middle if he's on his way to, well, it's juxtaposition, but it isn't as crude as that. It's woven in so subtly.
Yeah, I really do feel like this story feels very generous to me in a way.
Yes.
You know, it's generous to both the two central characters, but I also think it's generous to everyone in the passage you read, in the sense that, like, maybe your moral failures are not the failures of the universe. They are, like, maybe smaller than you think. And then I also think it's generous in the double life sense. I think that the story is sort of allowing us all to have a double life. I think there's a room in the story for, he's not singular in this way. I think he's sort of one of, I don't know, it felt very, like, radical to me to read a story that is, like, saying that it's not just the protagonist that is special. Actually, everybody is probably leading this kind of double life.
Yes. There's a lot of philosophy that's sort of woven into this story, and yet it never becomes difficult in that way.
Right.
But generous, I think, is exactly the right word.
And it makes me think of one of my favorite Alice Munro stories is What is Remembered, and it's about how a woman has a one-day romance with someone, and then that is described for maybe half the story. But then the kind of latter part of the story is her saying how she would always fantasize about them, having a rendezvous again or reuniting, and it never happens, but it just sustains her in a way, this idea. But even more than that, what always stood out to me is the idea that even after she hears that he dies, she still perpetuates this idea of them meeting again one day, because he actually didn't even need to be alive for that fantasy to be some kind of necessity in her life. And so that makes me think about, the end of the story. And I know you've talked, Jean, about how Chekhov isn't interested in answering the question, but what is the question that is raised in the end by having the final note be, them kind of or she, at least, she's crying and stuff, and planning the idea that they will be together. What do you at least take away from that, I guess?
Well, I think you have to add to that last scene the really important moment where he looks in the mirror and he sees how old he is.
Yes. Graying.
Yeah, so that, I think one of the things that makes Chekhov an astonishing writer is the scope. The context is very, very large. And I think that's what makes it generous in a way, is it just, he's not saying, the end of the story is, what are they going to do, and who are they going to divorce, no, and I was going to mention that there's another story, a trilogy of stories, and one of the stories is called About Love, and it is a story where the protagonist doesn't have the affair. And he resists, and it's about the misery of having to have this couple that is so entangled with each other, without having consummated their love, who are forced to separate. So Chekhov looked at both sides of it, and I think he comes down on this side, on the side of this story.
Yeah, it feels like by coming down on this side in this story, it feels very expansive, the story. I think when it's allowing the characters to feel and go through, and they're both inside an affair, but also constantly on the precipice of something, some new feeling, it feels like.
Yeah, and as a reader, you're not locked into thinking about, like, do I like this person? Do I agree with that? Those questions are so surface level compared to to where the story allows you to go in your mind with, in some ways, like what is the good life, or those very kind of philosophical questions.
Yeah, and yet, all right, so I've never criticized this story, but it's not a story for everyone to read.
Okay.
Because, there are some readers who need more guidance, and maybe it's not that they need an inferior story, but they need the tracking and the conclusion. I recently presented James's Washington Square to a group of scientists and historians, and they had a hard time with this novel because they didn't know what James was trying to say, and they expected James would say what he was trying to say.
Right.
And then I thought, wow, I was stunned, because I thought, this novel, Washington Square, seems to be a novel that does everything a novel should do, but it wasn't enough for this reader, these readers.
Quite often this story is still assigned, I think, and especially in undergrad classrooms.
Yes.
Do you feel like there might be a story that, like a Chekhov story, that you think is more accessible? Like, do you have one in mind?
Well, I think there's a wonderful story about a father and son that I think would be much more appropriate to where the father is just so. The little boy does something wrong. Oh, he's smoking cigarettes. He's 5 years old. He's smoking cigarettes, but the father is so conflicted about whether he doesn't want to punish him, and so I think when I think about what kids read in high school, I think all the books are the wrong books, and there's no effort made to bridge the gap between an adult and a young person.
And that affects the rest of their reading life.
Absolutely. It turns them off forever.
That's true. Is it time for our favorite lines? Or
I think so. Let me see. Actually, there is a question that you posed, Katie, that I think we should talk about first, which is that you mentioned how, for you, this story complicates the difference between a quiet story and a loud story. You say it's both. So I'm curious about that balance of melodrama and interiority, and what you think about that.
Yeah, I think I was interested in that balance largely because what we were talking about with the philosophy. I mean, I do feel like on the one hand it's a loud story in the sense that, oh, there's an affair and there's sex, implied, if not like laid out, and there's sort of a lot of deep feeling. It's quiet in the sense that, they meet, they part, they meet again, there's not a ton of action. But I think the sort of the hum of feeling beneath their actions feels very loud to me. And again, I think the expansiveness we were talking about feels loud to me. I don't think the story, as interested as it is in being grounded and sort of grounded in reality, I do think it's very willing to sort of float large ideas our way, and I think that's so hard to do. I don't know. I admire it, and I guess I'm interested. I think stories that have tension between the high and the low, or sort of different polar opposite things are the most interesting to me. And here for me, it's the quiet and the loud coming into contact with each other.
And it makes me wonder if that is how Chekhov experienced the world, because sometimes I read stories where the setting or the material world feels almost like cake decoration or something, and I can tell that this person who is writing the story actually is not interested in that loud and quiet kind of cross stitch. So I feel that from the story you get the sense of a mind that is embodied in the world. Yeah.
I just want to throw this in because this movement has disappeared. But when I was in graduate school, everyone was reading the so-called minimalists. Does that seem recognizable to you, the name?
Yes.
Yeah.
Like Raymond Carver?
Raymond Carver, Bobby Ann Mason. But the thing that appalled me, even when this movement was at its height, was characterization was done by product names.
Oh, wow.
And you could create the working class by talking about the kind of Barcalounger. And I was so offended by
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, but I think it's
that's what
responsive of the world, right? How they're experiencing the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it seemed to me a tremendous put down, in writing about the lower class or the working class. It was just a sense that you can nail them with what they buy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know?
I think
Defined
that's
by
still
consumerism,
true in some writing today, for
Yes.
sure. Absolutely. And I think what I see nowadays sometimes is it's done with like an ironic wink, yet it's still done, so it's not quite ironic. You're still signaling something,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know?
Well, and you're sort of saying, and these stories we published in the New Yorker, so you'd think, well, you people out there, you readers, you're above all this, and you know what we're talking about here. We're talking about Drek.
Right.
Yeah.
And really what's interesting with this story is, and I mean maybe also because it's in Russia, etc., but you don't need to know the specifics of the resort, the name, or any of these things, but you still have such a sense of place and who these people are within the fabric of the world, just from the details of when they're dining and going to the gardens or how they're behaving in the world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was thinking today, this is my edition, I think, has the perfect cover. I think that, and it's a Russian artist, but I think this demure, buttoned up, the way that her arm, this is
Absolutely.
perfect. Illustrations often go so far wrong. This, and she's not especially beautiful. She's and very contemplative. I thought and I think this was one of the artists that Chekhov really loved. Someone whose name was Levitin.
Oh, okay.
So
wait, let's show our viewers. You can see this. Yeah. Do you feel like when most people, and this is a throwaway question, I haven't thought it out. So, in the minds of many people, you go to Anna Karenina about affairs with Russian literature, but that affair in that case does take over the life, which is very different than this. Do you ever think about kind of that very famous affair in conversation with a little story like this, which also is encompassing a life at the same time?
They're just different modalities. It's like comparing Beethoven and Debussy. They're just different. They're valid each in its own way.
Right. That's fair.
Yeah. A good next step for our listeners to refresh yourself on.
Exactly. Now, should we do favorite lines?
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to do yours first, Katie?
Yes,
Do you
I
have
have
it?
to pull it up.
How about I hand you this? I have it ready to go.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I think that my favorite line actually really dovetails with the passage that you read earlier, but it's this. And he judged of others by himself, not believing in what he saw, and always believing that every man had his real, most interesting life under the cover of secrecy and under the cover of night. So again, it's part of that double life passage and the generosity we were talking about. But I love that the generosity is not just from Chekhov, the writer, but it's also imbued to the man, to Gorov himself. He is believing that other people have their real interesting lives under the cover of night. And I think that's sort of the turn you don't necessarily expect when you start the story and you think, oh, this is a cat, and maybe this is just another in a series of affairs. I think he is very admirable in this moment, and I'm really in the corner of this man. So I just like that line and the way that I'm able to sort of get in his corner with just this sort of one description of what he thinks of other people.
Yeah.
Especially when, we talked about how he feels most comfortable with women. He's clearly drawn to women, this character. But, he is able to sort of think this way universally about people. It sort of opens him up a little bit. And this way you can sort of see how maybe the affair, it's convenient for an affair to make you a better person, but it is potentially here.
Well, you could at least say it enlightens him.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to put it.
Especially because I think what is unsaid is that we meet a lot of protagonists that are more likely to feel that their experiences set them apart from others,
Yeah, exactly.
rather than connect them with others. And that's part of their mythology. That's part of their double life, is that they have like kind of extraordinary experiences or thoughts or feelings. So.
And there'll be a special allowance for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Jean, I know you already read some passages that you love. Did you have any other ones that you wanted to call out?
You know, just to give people a sense of how funny Chekhov can be, I'm going to read something, not one of my favorites, but I think it's when Gurov comes back to Russia and he's so glad it's snowing and, you know, it's back to normal, he's nothing to worry about. And then what happens is he wants to tell somebody about what's happened to him because he's consumed by the love affair, and so he's out with a buddy, and what he says is, "Oh, if you knew what a fascinating woman I met in Yalta." The civil servant got into his sleigh and was about to be driven off, but suddenly he turned around and called out, "I say, yes, you were quite right. The sturgeon was a bit off." I mean, this is almost like a piece of vaudeville.
Yeah.
But there it is, and you know.
Yeah, it's very funny. And it makes me think of Katie's quote to maybe overanalyze it or make it more serious, is that there's a way where a lesser protagonist would say, like, I am not like this person, right? Like, look how, like, he won't engage on this, like, other topic
Right.
or whatnot,
Right.
but he's not doing that, which is really wonderful. Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about?
I'm sure there is.
I will say it's also a wonderful story to read when it's over 90 degrees out in the middle of the summer. Just hearing the word sleigh and
Yes.
snow is quite lovely. But thank you very much for listening, and we hope you get a chance to read the story and think about it. And thank you so much, Jean, for joining the
Thanks.
Short Story Boudoir today.
And thanks for having me.
Yeah, wonderful.
Now we're going to finish our treats from Yellow. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.